The gun was pressed against Bumpy Johnson's chest. Lucky Luciano's finger was on the trigger. The warehouse was silent except for the sound of 30 men breathing, waiting, watching to see if the most powerful black gangster in America was about to die. But Bumpy didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who'd already won a game nobody else knew they were playing. In that moment, standing in a warehouse on the edge of Brooklyn with death inches away, Bumpy Johnson demonstrated something that would define his entire legacy. Not how to survive violence. How to make violence unnecessary. How to transform a killing into a lesson that would echo through New York for decades. This is the story of why Bumpy Johnson's mercy was more dangerous than any gun. To understand this, you need to understand something fundamental about power. Most people think power is about what you can destroy. About how many people you can kill. About how much pain you can inflict. That's what every mob boss before Bumpy Johnson believed. That's what every street operator thought. You want respect? You kill someone. You want control? You eliminate the threat. You want dominance? You make examples. You make them hurt. You make them bleed so everyone else understands the cost of crossing you. But Bumpy Johnson looked at this equation and saw something everyone else missed. He saw that killing people was actually weak. Here's why. When you kill someone, the story ends. They're gone. They can't spread your message anymore. They can't walk around carrying proof of what you did. They can't spend the rest of their lives as a walking advertisement for your power. But when you break someone without killing them, when you destroy them psychologically while keeping them alive, that's different. That person becomes something far more valuable than a corpse. They become a warning. A living, breathing, visible warning that says, this is what happens if you cross Bumpy Johnson. And the power of that message is exponential. September 14, 1931. 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Lenox Avenue. Officer Patrick O'Reilly was a corrupt cop in the 28th Precinct. 6 feet tall, 230 pounds, hands that had beaten down 100 black prisoners, a badge that made him feel invincible. He was walking his beat, feeling like the king of Harlem, when he saw her. Margaret Johnson. Bumpy's mother. 58 years old, carrying groceries, walking slowly because arthritis made every step painful. She was wearing a church dress. She'd just come from Sunday service. O'Reilly stepped directly into her path. Move, he said, using that word, the word that was designed to strip dignity. The word that was meant to remind black people of their supposed place. Margaret tried to step aside. She was fast enough, respectful enough, but she wasn't fast enough for O'Reilly's rage. He raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed across Lenox Avenue like a gunshot. 200 people watched it happen. They watched Margaret stumble backward. They watched her hand go to her face. They watched her tears of humiliation. And they watched Bumpy Johnson, standing 6 feet away, do absolutely nothing. He didn't swing. Didn't shout. Didn't charge at O'Reilly. He just stood there. Watching. His jaw locked. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. But his face showed nothing except absolute control. Everyone in that street understood what that meant. Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to react in anger. He was going to respond strategically. And strategic responses from Bumpy Johnson were far worse than anything anger could produce. This is where understanding Bumpy's mind becomes critical. Most men would have beaten O'Reilly right there. Right in front of everyone. It would have been justified. It would have been satisfying. It would have shown the community that Bumpy protected his people. But Bumpy understood something deeper. If he attacked O'Reilly in the street, O'Reilly could have him arrested. O'Reilly had a badge. O'Reilly had the police department behind him. O'Reilly had a system that would protect him from a black man's rage but not from a black man's strategy. So Bumpy made a decision that most people would have interpreted as weakness. He let O'Reilly walk away feeling victorious. He let O'Reilly go back to the precinct and brag about how he'd put some colored woman in her place and her son had been too much of a coward to respond. O'Reilly believed he'd won. That belief was the beginning of his destruction. Because Bumpy Johnson had a file on Patrick O'Reilly. Not just casual knowledge. An actual file. Details about O'Reilly's connections, his corruption, his secrets, the things that would destroy his career and his reputation if they ever became public. And now, with O'Reilly feeling confident, feeling like he'd proven something, Bumpy had justification to act. 72 hours after slapping Margaret Johnson, Patrick O'Reilly left his apartment for work. He never made it to the precinct. Bumpy's men intercepted him on the street. They didn't use guns. They didn't make noise. They simply took him. Transported him to a location nobody knew about. A place where screams couldn't be heard. A place where the city's rules didn't apply. For 3 days, O'Reilly disappeared. During those 3 days, every person at the 28th precinct was searching for him. His wife was calling in a panic. His captain was organizing search parties. The NYPD was launching an investigation into a missing officer. But nobody could find him. Because Bumpy understood something that most criminals missed. Uncertainty is more powerful than information. Not knowing where someone is, not knowing what's happening to them, not knowing if they're alive or dead, that uncertainty creates a specific kind of terror that facts can never match. Friday morning. 6:45 a.m. Officer Patrick O'Reilly was found tied to the iron railing outside the 28th precinct. He was alive. His bones weren't broken. There were no visible signs of torture. But his eyes were empty. He was mumbling the same 2 words over and over again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For the next 37 years, for the rest of his life, those were the only words. Patrick O'Reilly would speak with any consistency. His mind had been broken. Not by physical pain. By psychological devastation so complete that his personality essentially ceased to exist. He was transferred to a mental institution. He was medically retired from the police force. He lived the rest of his life in and out of psychiatric care, a living monument to what happened when you disrespected Bumpy Johnson's family. And here's what made this so strategically brilliant. The NYPD couldn't prove what happened. There were no witnesses. There was no body. There was no crime scene. Just a broken man who couldn't or wouldn't explain what had been done to him. But everyone in the police department knew what had happened. Everyone in Harlem knew what had happened. Everyone understood that Bumpy Johnson could reach into your life, destroy you completely, and leave no evidence. That the man who beat you would walk free. That you would be the one who disappeared into mental institutions. That knowledge, spread through the police force, spread through Harlem, spread through every criminal network in New York, was worth infinitely more than beating O'Reilly would have been. Because now every cop understood. You don't just disrespect Bumpy Johnson and face consequences. You disrespect him and spend the rest of your life wishing you died instead. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. A carefully developed methodology that Bumpy refined over decades. Consider what happened to a man named Calvin Moore in 1965. Calvin was a numbers runner who skimmed money to pay for his brother's medical bills. Understandable motivation. Human motivation. But he made a mistake. He went to the Italian mob to cover his tracks. Betrayed Bumpy in the process. Bumpy could have killed him. Should have killed him, according to the rules of organized crime. Betrayal meant death. Everyone knew that. Instead, Bumpy did something different. He paid Calvin's brother's medical bills. Completely. Fully. No cost to Calvin. Then he brought Calvin to a meeting where he was supposed to be killed. In that moment, with Calvin facing 5 men with guns, expecting death, Bumpy revealed that he'd known about the betrayal all along. That he'd paid the bills to clear Calvin's conscience. That he was giving Calvin one chance to choose, loyalty or death. Calvin chose loyalty. But here's what Bumpy had actually accomplished. He'd taken a man who'd already crossed him and transformed him into someone so indebted, so grateful, so conscious of how close he'd come to death, that Calvin became more loyal afterward than he would have been if Bumpy had just kept him on the payroll. The mercy wasn't weakness. It was psychological mastery. A man who worked for Bumpy for 15 years was asked once why Bumpy never seemed to have enemies who'd turned permanently against him. The man thought carefully before answering. Bumpy understood something about human nature, he said. Most people can forgive being beaten. The body heals. The humiliation fades. But if you show someone mercy when they deserve death, if you spare them when you have absolute power, that creates a debt that never goes away. A man who's been beaten by you might plan revenge. A man whose life you've spared, whose family you've protected, whose brother you've paid for. That man spends the rest of his life understanding exactly what Bumpy owns. This is the core of Bumpy Johnson's philosophy about power. It's not about being nice. It's not about being weak. It's about understanding that psychological leverage is stronger than physical force. When you beat someone up, you trigger their fight response. Their pride kicks in. They start planning how to hurt you back. You've created an enemy. But when you show mercy to someone you have complete power over, when you spare them, help them, protect their family, you create something far more powerful. You create obligation. You create gratitude mixed with fear. You create a person who understands, on a cellular level, that you own them. And that understanding doesn't fade with time. It intensifies. But this system had a dark side. A side that Bumpy understood but that many of his associates didn't fully appreciate. Creating invisible obligation networks is powerful, but it's also corrosive. A man named James Quick Jackson worked for Bumpy for 20 years. During that time, Bumpy helped him multiple times. Paid his debts. Kept him out of jail. Protected his family. All without asking for immediate repayment. Years later, when Bumpy called in those debts and used Jackson for a dangerous operation, Jackson felt trapped. He felt resentful. He felt like the help he'd been given had been a trap all along. I realized, Jackson said in an interview years later, that every time Bumpy helped me, I wasn't getting free assistance. I was getting a loan. And the interest was my soul. There's a moral complexity here that can't be ignored. Yes, Bumpy's system was extraordinarily effective. Yes, it gave him power that no amount of violence could match. Yes, it allowed him to control hundreds of people across the city with a kind of invisible authority that police and federal agents couldn't even detect. But the cost to the people in that system was real. The sense of being owned. The sense of having your autonomy stripped away not through force, but through gratitude. The knowledge that you can never fully escape because you'll always owe. That's a cage made of kindness. And cages made of kindness are the hardest to escape because you feel guilty about wanting to leave. By 1955, Bumpy Johnson had probably helped 300 people directly. He'd paid for hospital bills, funeral expenses, legal fees, housing costs, business startups. He'd gotten people out of jail. He'd protected them from violence. He'd intervened when they were about to make terrible mistakes. To the people of Harlem, he was a benefactor. A protector. A man who genuinely cared about his community. And that was all true. But simultaneously, every single person he'd helped had become part of an obligation network. They were entries in a ledger that Bumpy kept in his mind. Not written down, he was too smart for that, but meticulously tracked. When he needed 15 men to handle a crisis immediately, he didn't have to negotiate. He just had to make phone calls. And those 15 men showed up, fully armed, ready to do whatever was required, because they understood what Bumpy had done for them and what it would cost if they refused. This is how Bumpy controlled Harlem without formal authority. Not through fear, though fear was part of it. Through obligation. Through the knowledge that Bumpy's mercy was conditional. That it could be revoked. Perhaps the clearest example of Bumpy's strategic mercy came in 1952. A man named Charlie Morrison was an escaped convict, a KKK member, desperate and armed. He walked into Bumpy's wife's dress shop and held her at gunpoint, planning to rob it. This was the ultimate provocation. Not just a threat to Bumpy's business. Not just disrespect. A direct attack on his wife. According to every rule of organized crime, Charlie Morrison should have been killed in that dress shop. Or at least brutally tortured. Or at minimum permanently disabled. Instead, Bumpy cut him. One clean slash across the throat. Not deep enough to kill. Deep enough to scar. Enough to cause severe psychological trauma. Then he let Morrison live. Morrison went back to Georgia, back to death row, where he was already scheduled to be executed for another crime, carrying that scar as a permanent reminder of the day he learned that Bumpy Johnson couldn't be victimized. Every person who saw that scar, every person who heard Morrison's story, understood the message. Bumpy didn't just win. He won in a way that left you alive to understand your defeat. That's psychological mastery. What's fascinating is how Bumpy's philosophy evolved over his lifetime. In his early years, in the 1930s and 40s, Bumpy was more violent. He fought Dutch Schultz's men. He threw people off roofs. He used brutality as a tool because he was younger and because it was necessary to establish himself as someone who couldn't be challenged physically. But as he aged, as he consolidated power, as he built his obligation networks larger and more sophisticated, Bumpy used violence less and less. Why? Because he'd discovered something more powerful. By the 1950s and 60s, Bumpy could control the entire neighborhood without firing a single shot. Because everyone owed him. Because everyone understood that his mercy was conditional. Because the system had become so interlocking that challenging it was impossible. A man named Illinois Gordon, one of Bumpy's oldest associates, described it this way. When Bumpy was young, he had to fight with his fists. When he got old, he fought with his mind. And his mind was more dangerous than his fists ever were. This is the paradox of true power. The most dangerous people are the ones who've learned that they don't have to use violence to win. Because that knowledge removes all restraint. If Bumpy ever decided to go fully violent, nobody in the city could stop him. Everyone understood that. So instead, they simply obeyed. To understand why Bumpy's mercy was more effective than violence, you have to understand human psychology. When someone beats you up, your brain registers it as a temporary problem. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it's humiliating. But pain fades. Bruises heal. The memory becomes abstract. But when someone shows you mercy after having absolute power over you, when they could kill you but choose not to, when they could destroy you but choose to help you instead, that creates a different neurological response. It creates gratitude mixed with fear. It creates the understanding that you exist at someone else's discretion. That your life, your family's well-being, your future, all of it is conditional on Bumpy's continued goodwill. That knowledge doesn't fade. It intensifies with time. Every day you live, you're conscious of the fact that Bumpy could have ended you but didn't. A man in Bumpy's obligation network wasn't just afraid of Bumpy. He was grateful to Bumpy. He owed Bumpy. He felt indebted in a way that transcended simple employment or criminal partnership. This is why Bumpy's system was so stable. You can enforce loyalty through fear, but fear breaks eventually. People get desperate. They get angry. They look for ways to escape. But obligation? Obligation combined with genuine gratitude? That's much harder to escape. Because you feel guilty about wanting to leave. You feel like you'd be betraying someone who saved your life. But mercy had a cost for Bumpy too. It required absolute restraint. It required not acting on every provocation. It required the discipline to let people disrespect him publicly, knowing that he was planning a response that wouldn't come for weeks or months. It required trust in a system rather than in immediate violence. There was one incident in 1958 when 5 racist guards in Alcatraz beat Bumpy nearly to death. They wanted to break him. They wanted him to beg. They wanted to prove that white power was absolute. Bumpy could have arranged for those guards to be killed after his release. He had the capability. He had the motivation. He had every reason to destroy them. Instead, he did nothing. One of his associates asked him why. Why let them live? Why let them escape consequences? Bumpy's answer was revealing. They already lost, he said. They beat me nearly to death and I'm still standing. I'm still the same person. My spirit is intact. That's victory. If I kill them, I prove their point, that we solve things through violence. But I've already proven their point wrong just by surviving them unchanged. This is the ultimate expression of Bumpy's philosophy. He didn't just use mercy as a tactic. He understood it as a demonstration of power itself. By the time Bumpy died in 1968, he'd built something that outlasted him. Not just a criminal organization. Not just a numbers racket. But a system of obligation and mutual protection that continued functioning even after his death. People he'd helped 20 years earlier still felt indebted. They still protected his memory. They still followed his principles even though he wasn't there to enforce them. His widow, Bumpy Johnson, was protected for decades after his death simply because of the goodwill he'd built. Not because anyone feared him anymore, but because they remembered what he'd done for them. The story of Bumpy Johnson became a legend in Harlem, not primarily because of the violence he'd inflicted, but because of the mercy he'd shown. People told stories about how he'd saved someone's life by paying a hospital bill. How he'd gotten someone out of jail through legal maneuvering. How he'd protected someone's family when they had nowhere else to turn. These stories, repeated thousands of times over decades, created a mythology around Bumpy that transcended his actual criminal activities. He became less a gangster and more a protector. Less a criminal and more a community leader. Less a man who had taken lives and more a man who had saved them. What truly separated Bumpy Johnson from every other crime figure of his era was how he understood power. Most gangsters measured it by bodies, territory, and fear. Bumpy measured it by obligation. By how many people depended on him. By how much of the city functioned because people knew that defying him didn't bring retaliation, it meant losing his protection. This is why law enforcement eventually stopped trying to dismantle him. Not because they lacked evidence, but because no one would testify. His operations were buried beneath layers of loyalty, favors, and rescued lives. You can arrest a criminal if witnesses exist. But how do you prosecute a man when every witness believes they owe him their survival? Yet this truth must be faced clearly: Bumpy's mercy was not kindness. It was control. He spared people not because he was good, but because mercy was more effective than violence. The people he helped were not free. A woman whose child he educated could never refuse him. A man whose life he saved could never walk away. A family he protected could never set its own terms. They were owned, not by threats, but by gratitude. This is the darker reality behind the mythology. Bumpy Johnson's mercy was a cage built from kindness. Most people didn't realize they were imprisoned until they tried to leave. And this idea reaches far beyond organized crime. The same psychology operates in business, politics, and personal relationships. A leader who helps people, invests in them, and protects them often wields more control than one who rules through fear. Gratitude lasts longer than intimidation. Obligation is more stable than terror. Bumpy understood something many legitimate leaders never do: power doesn't come from how much pain you can inflict, but from how much help you can provide in ways that can never be fully repaid. Years later, when asked if he had regrets, Bumpy paused before answering. "My system worked too well," he said. "People thought they were being helped, and they were, but they were also trapped. Not by chains. By gratitude. If I could do it again," he added, "I'd try to help without creating obligation. But I don't know if that's possible. Help always creates a relationship. And relationships always carry power." Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, collapsing in a Harlem restaurant. Thousands attended his funeral, not out of fear, but recognition. They came because he proved something few ever understand. Power isn't measured by the bodies you leave behind. Control isn't built through violence. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's mercy shown from a position of absolute dominance. Because once someone understands what they owe you, that knowledge never fades. It grows. It compounds. It becomes part of who they are. That was Bumpy Johnson's real legacy. Not brutality. Not fear. But the lasting psychological weight of a gift that can never be repaid.